What's next on the Browns offseason checklist now that they filled their offensive coordinator vacancy? We'll talk about it next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast. I'm proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. I will walk you through the key items that are next up on the Browns offseason checklist now that they officially have an offensive coordinator. Myles Garrett has spoken out yet again, and new details about Deshaun Watson's relationship with the rest of his Cleveland Browns teammates. I do want to thank you for being an everydayer with the Locked On Browns podcast and making us your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play just $5. Let's get after it. And the Cleveland Browns obviously named their new offensive coordinator this week in Tommy Rees. And with that off the list, they can now pivot to other key decisions and things that they need to assess and address this offseason. And so I think it's kind of a good exercise this time of year to sort of walk through what the offseason checklist looks like for the Browns here in the months ahead. And I do think, as much talk as there's been about the quarterback position, what they're going to do at the quarterback position, if they're going to take a rookie, and that is going to be on this list. I will get to that here in a second. I actually do think the number one thing at the top of this list for the Cleveland Browns is working out a contract extension with Myles Garrett, if they're serious about extending him. And I know we have some updated information on Myles and how he feels about his future from this week's episode of Hard Knocks, the final episode of the in-season version. But I do think Myles, even though he obviously made the comments he made back in December about pursuing, other options if the goals don't align for him and the Browns, I've kind of felt all along that all of this could be smoothed over if they just come to an agreement on a contract extension and they get this thing essentially worked out where, okay, you're paid handsomely again. You're the top paid defensive player. No one's the wiser. We're all good here. Let's just kind of keep it moving. And, part of this is he only has the 2 years left on his deal. And really after this, going into this year, there's not like a ton of guaranteed money left in his contract. Not that the Browns are going to cut him or anything, but this is when guys start to, sort of force the issue, guys who have the ability to do that, to try to work out a new extension. And so it felt like this was kind of a teaser for that anyway, those comments. And now it just feels like the right time to get that deal done and get him paid. There was also some comments from, I think it was Andrew Berry, who sort of alluded to there'll be something coming here in the future in terms of like Myles and his contract. So it does feel like the two sides are going to sort of work towards that. And the other part of this too is just Myles at this point, AAV of his contract at about $25 million a year. He's underpaid in terms of the type of player that he is and what he probably feels warranted to be making when, as the status and the player that he certainly is in this league. And so this kind of leads into, I think, a discussion of like what that new deal looks like. The number to beat right now in terms of AAV is $34 million, which is what Nick Bosa makes. I don't know if Myles Garrett could become the first player to get a $40 million AAV. That would basically mean that the Browns would have to get that deal up to $200 million a year over 5 years. This contract expires once he's into his 30s. So I don't know how much, if they want to commit that long, although it's Myles Garrett and you feel pretty good about like the payoff being there early on in the contract, whatever extension you would sign, it'd be worth it if you're paying him a little bit later into his 30s. But I don't know. I don't know if he gets to 34 AAV, but he is going to want to top that number, especially as he's out here proclaiming after that Steelers win this year that he's proven he's the best pass rusher in the sport. So I don't know. I'm thinking something in the range of probably like 36 to 38 is more so what falls in line for Garrett. I don't know if he'll jump all the way to 40. There may be some others who, are looking for contract extensions themselves. Trey Hendrickson being one of the guys who is looking for a contract extension. He made that clear last year for the Bengals, and he just finishes the top sack, the sack king, I should say, in this past year, which is notable for him, something he can use as leverage, something he can use in contract negotiations. And so that's why it's also, I think, prudent that this is near the top of the Browns list of things that they need to that they need to check off, because you don't want to see him sign first, Trey Hendrickson, that is, and then make the price go up even more on Myles Garrett, because he's going to want to top whoever is the top defensive end or edge rusher on the market. And so, yeah, we'll see where he kind of falls, but something in the range of, I think, like 36 to 37, if it was, or 38 rather. If it was 37 a year, that brings you to like 185 over like 5 years potentially if they sign him that long. So that's kind of what I'm envisioning for Myles, but that is, I think, a top priority to get him paid, get him under contract, appease all sides, and be able to kind of run off together in, kumbaya. I think a lot of the talk about where he wants to, if he would consider other options in the future, goes away once he gets a new contract and he feels like he's paid for his efforts to, comparably at the level that he believes he's still playing at. So I think that is honestly priority number one. Get that done and taken care of. And then I think number two becomes the big overarching, cloud hanging over this organization that we've been talking about a lot already, which is identifying what your plan is at quarterback. Do you think these guys in the draft are worth drafting at number two? Either of them, Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. If you're not going to draft one, well, and I guess the other caveat, which we talked about on yesterday's show, are you even going to have the ability to draft one or the other? Like if you only like one, if you like Cam Ward, will he be there too? If you like Shedeur Sanders, is his dad, and I know Deion Sanders recently just made some comments about there are a couple teams that he would not let his son play for. So I'm assuming they will find a way to draw a line in the sand and sort of set their path up how they want it. Are you even going to have the ability to draft him if they make things ugly and try to force their way to a certain team? So if that's the case, what does the quarterback room look like around a rookie? I've kind of said all along, I think they'll probably draft a rookie, whether it's in the first round, second round, whatever. So I think that's obviously a given. And I think it helps that I know this came out yesterday too. Bubba Ventrone, special teams coordinator, he is going to serve as the head coach of the American team in the Senior Bowl. So a chance to sort of get a real close look at some of these players and these quarterbacks. And so, yeah, I think they'll draft a quarterback in some capacity. It's just a matter about what that is. And based off of that, and based on the offensive coordinator that you hired in Tommy Rees, who it seems like is going to be one of these like in lockstep, sort of a partnership in terms of building the offense and Kevin Stefanski's vision, what does the room look like around a rookie, and what quarterback makes sense to pursue, or quarterbacks make sense to pursue to achieve the goals that you're trying to achieve, which is revamp this offense and get it back to prominence like you had when Stefanski was running the show and the play caller and all that stuff before the Deshaun Watson debacle even started. So that is priority number two. And then the third thing I threw on here for now is just once you think you know what you want to do at quarterback, what are the other big major key holes that you have to fill, and how are you going to address those? And I sort of wrote down, I think left tackle is where that kind of starts. Whatever quarterback you're getting, you got to solidify that offensive line in front of them. I think left tackle probably is the biggest need for this team beyond the quarterback spot. So if you're going to use that draft pick on a quarterback and you feel pretty good about that, and that's going to be the case, okay, what does that mean for your left tackle spot? Are you going to go find one in free agency, or are you going to still draft one maybe in the second round or something like that? So I think that sort of sets the tone, because, and here's the other thing, there's other like branch things that come off of this. Like once you figure out what you're doing at quarterback, or what you think you're going to do at quarterback, that sort of sets up like, okay, you're going to trade back in the draft and get as much capital as possible. And so there's that. I also think along the lines of the Myles Garrett extension, you got to figure out if you're Andrew Berry, what cap space you have, how you're going to finagle this salary cap situation, because it's not good right now. But you can quickly sort of open up some space if you're able to move some money around, and again, do some of those void years that he likes to do. It doesn't it sets a bad precedent moving forward. Obviously, we know that, but it's the sort of situation that the Browns are in where that's how they need to create the needed flexibility to make the moves that they want to make this offseason. So I think that obviously is up there on that list as well. But those are the three big things that I'm kind of looking at, including the finagling the salary cap. And that brings us to coming up next, where Myles Garrett, speaking of his future with the team, had some recent comments on that exact thing, sort of going back on what he said a couple weeks ago. We'll talk about it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are just better with FanDuel. And right now, new customers commit $5 to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. I'm sure you would like $2,000 in bonus bets. Unfortunately, that's not the deal. It's $200. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. Visit their website and to share betting lines around the team or league. I'm a big anytime touchdown parlay builder myself during this time of year, really throughout the season, but definitely during the postseason. And sometimes, because you're always hyper-focused on like one game during the playoffs at a time, I get really spicy and I try to nail the first touchdown score in any game and see if I can win big that way. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets, whether your bet wins or loses. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Okay, so there were some interesting comments made by Myles Garrett on the final episode of the in-season version of Hard Knocks. And I think this is notable because, again, we heard him sort of put on the Dog and Pony show a couple weeks ago, where he's sitting up there saying, like, listen, if our goals don't align, if the team's not trying to win and be competitive right now, I could see myself playing somewhere else. And it's a fair thing for it's a fair thing for him to want and to say. He's one of the only people, maybe the only person on the roster who has the power to sort of put the organization in that bind or hold their feet to the fire a little bit. And so I've respected him for doing it. I get what he's trying to do there, and I understand he's trying to just put the team in a situation to be successful. And he wants to see this team not just like throw in the towel. He wants to see them continue to try to win in pursuit of greatness and chasing Super Bowls and all those things. So several weeks later now, and with post the end of season, conversations that teams have, the exit interviews that teams have now in the books, Myles, it seems like, has sort of changed his tune, which is good news on the front of him sticking around. It's also, sets the tone for what's going to be probably a pretty busy offseason as they try to figure out what this thing looks like around Myles and just in general, and how you get this team back to competing at a high level after a 3-14 season. But the exact quote from Myles Garrett on this latest episode of Hard Knocks was, quote, "I've talked to general manager Andrew Berry, how we going to make the most of all the talent that is here. We're closer than some may think we are." So from saying, again, back in December, it's a possibility that I could play somewhere else if the team isn't trying to win right now, to now all of a sudden saying we're closer than we think, or we're closer than it might seem. That must have been a hell of an exit interview, because they must have painted a pretty clear picture to him of, here's what our plans are, here's what we think we can do, we're going to go do this. Maybe they told him that they have plans to draft a rookie quarterback in the first round. Who knows? But that must have been a pretty damn good, pardon my French, plan to get him to change his tune so quickly. And I do think, though, this speaks to, again, what I said earlier. Like, I don't know that it was ever Myles Garrett was really going to force his way out this year. maybe that's something that would come down the line. But it felt more like, again, coming up on needing a contract extension, trying to sort of flex some leverage, making it clear like I don't want to go, I don't want to necessarily stick around longer term if this team isn't going to do this and isn't going to try to win. But I always felt like this was going to be the path forward anyway. And I think Andrew Berry clarified that too at his end of season press conference, that like they are always looking to compete. They're not looking for some massive teardown and start all over. And I do think, and the Browns are a prime example of this. I mean, you did 60, you as a fan suffered through 16 and 17 and 1 and 31 under Hugh Jackson to get to a point where the team was supposed to be in the running for Super Bowls with all the young talent that they had acquired. And what happened? You got 2 playoff trips out of it, 1 playoff win out of it to this point, and it didn't turn out the way that anybody expected, especially once they made the Deshaun Watson trade, and that's gone terribly. So I understand where, Myles wants to force the organization to sort of try to win here, and where there was maybe questions that they would do that if they were going to try to sort of start all over and do a reset. But I don't know that like resetting in the NFL gets you what you want either. And that's kind of the point that Andrew Berry made, was like in this sport specifically, it doesn't really behoove you to do that. Like, where does it get you? There's no guarantees. Maybe you get the quarterback and that changes the whole projection of your franchise moving forward. But that's like, a hope and a prayer. And I think the Browns for decades spent time trying to just like stink enough to try to land that quarterback, and they missed so many times that now it was time to sort of think about it a different way. And like, do they still have to land that quarterback? Of course. Maybe this is the year they can do it because of the circumstances they've ended up so high in the draft. Maybe they get a package of picks that allows them to trade up next year and get that potential quarterback that they really like. But ultimately, I wasn't really ever thinking that the organization wasn't going to try to win. And so I figured this would sort of smooth itself out and that Myles would be happy. And clearly in those exit interviews, they gave him enough of a plan to feel comfortable and confident about the direction that they're heading. Now, it's not going to be easy. It becomes easier if you were able to draft that franchise quarterback at number 2. But I have some doubts about this class. So I'm assuming that they are starting to map out, as we talked about on the offseason checklist or to-do list. I assume that they have, some contingency plans, some thoughts on what they're going to do, whether that's Kirk Cousins, whether that's another Vikings quarterback in Daniel Jones, like whatever their plans might be. I think they have multiple options, and I think Myles sort of taking these comments back is on 2 fronts, that they sort of sold him on whatever they're going to do, but also he probably understands like they're going to try to work out a contract extension with him. And I think that is the baseline thing. Like once that was going to be done, you would have been, I feel like Myles wouldn't have been saying any of this stuff. Like that's how it works in the NFL. Like you use things as leverage in your favor to negotiate new contracts and get the money that you're looking for. And so I think that's kind of the position that Myles was put in. Now, whether or not we think the plan is going to work is to be determined, I guess. I understand where maybe you and I know other Browns fans felt that the stripping it down and starting all over thing was the route to go. Like I laid out, I don't know that is really something that you have to do in the NFL. And I don't know if it's ever like the most viable thing in the NFL either. It's just, to me, it just speaks to being a bad organization and a volatile organization. If all you do is like tear it all down and start all over every 6 to 7 years because your window of contention closed. Like there's ways to sort of rebuild on the fly too. Yes, you got to land that quarterback, but there's no guarantees at the end of that strip down that it all comes together. So understanding that, I can, it's not like the clearest to pass. It's going to be hard because the Deshaun Watson contract situation makes this entire thing difficult to navigate from a salary cap standpoint, from a roster standpoint. What are you going to be able to do? And yeah, a lot of that's going to involve moving money around and paying it down later. And that's not necessarily the best, world to live in as a GM or as a team. But the Browns are in this situation, and it's going to be fascinating to see how Andrew Berry tries to sort of tiptoe around some of the speed bumps and hurdles that he might have with this team right now, with this roster right now, in order to try to get the team back on track and to winning. So we'll see what that looks like again as the offseason unfolds. I think this ties into the offseason to-do list or checklist that the Browns are sort of that I laid out for you. Extending Myles being the top thing, and then figuring out what your quarterback situation is going to look like. But everyone who's out here saying like this team lacked talent, I don't think it was that we miscalculated how talented they were. I just think a lot of guys didn't play up to their standard. And I do think like the talent is still there. And maybe it wasn't like some of this too depends on like scheme and system. Like we know the offense wasn't a fit for this offensive line. If you get back to what you do well, maybe that changes and all of a sudden we feel good about this offensive line again, or pieces of this offensive line again. I understand they're an older group, but like Jack Conklin had a really good end of the season. So I think there's room to sort of, year to year, yes, sometimes your talent discrepancies change, but it does feel like I don't think they're as far off in terms of the talent gap that people seem to be pointing to as some may believe. Speaking of offseason changes, we know the quarterback room is going to look different. Deshaun Watson likely out for the entire 2025 season, and new details have emerged on how some of his teammates feel about him and felt about his injury situation. We will talk about it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions that you might have forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions that I hadn't even realized I was still paying. I thought I'd turn them off, and Rocket Money made it easier to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and helps you cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, or helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals that you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. All right, so some interesting details did emerge this week on the Deshaun Watson front. It feels like we're always talking about the Deshaun Watson situation in some capacity. Everything goes back to the Deshaun Watson situation. All roads lead to the Deshaun Watson situation. Why are the Browns where they're at? Deshaun Watson situation. Well, what are the Browns going to do moving forward? Well, they're going to be handicapped because of the Deshaun Watson situation. Seems like it's always the common theme here with this team, but understandably so. And a new piece from the Athletics, Jason Lloyd, who's obviously an in-tune reporter with everything that's kind of going on with the Cleveland sports scene. He's been at it for years. He gets these intels from players and his sources. There were some interesting comments in the piece that he put out just about how the team basically catered everything to Deshaun Watson, and they're paying the price because they did that. Some interesting nuggets from this one included maybe the most prominent line that people were sort of talking about. This idea that once Deshaun Watson did go down with the injury, not that it was celebrated in the locker room. We heard the response from players, given how fans responded in real time to the injury that he suffered, which, did not go over well. The fact that some people, again, not all fans, sort of celebrated it. There were some comments made that Jason Lloyd highlighted in this piece that, quote, players told me there was a constant heaviness surrounding Watson in the locker room and that they felt a different energy in the building upon his departure after the Achilles injury in October. A couple of veterans told me it was like a cloud had been lifted. I think so. Here's what I'll say from my perspective on this, because again, I wasn't the one who had this information sourced. But I can tell you that being in that locker room every single day, there was a different feel and a different vibe about the team and just the locker room environment in general once Deshaun was kind of not around as much. And I think that was also true last year. I guess last year now is 2024. I think that was also true in 2023 when Deshaun went down with the season-ending shoulder injury and missed an extended period of time. And basically, you were sitting there with a situation where Joe Flacco comes in, leads the team to the playoffs, and it's easy. Like, I sort of chalked it up that year to, well, when you're winning and you're going to the playoffs and you have this quarterback who's putting up big numbers, of course it's easy to, have good vibes in the locker room and feel good. So I kind of just felt, yeah, when you're winning, everything feels good in the locker room and the environment's completely different. But then to see it unfold this year in a 3-14 season where the team wasn't really any good anyway, but the vibe still changed and there was like a different just feeling around Jameis Winston for that stretch that he played. And you could tell the offense actually had a chance to score and do some things and, win some football games. And they did do that. Like it changed completely. And again, that was on a 3-14 football team. That was the biggest difference for me is like seeing it 2 years in a row in two polar opposite scenarios. One where you go into the playoffs and it's euphoric. One where you are 3-14 and the season's been terrible. And in both instances, things felt different when the starting quarterback that embattled as he is, and I guess controversial in some ways, not some ways, a lot of ways as he is, was no longer sort of around. I think that was pretty telling to how the team sort of felt about his presence and, how the team was sort of just vibing in general with him in this locker room and as part of this franchise. I'm not saying that means like they don't like him as a teammate because I think they've made it pretty clear, especially with the reactions, the raw reactions you got after the injury to how people reacted to it. It was evident to me that they still from a football sense and a player sense, there's always a sense of respect in that locker room for guys that are like in that building with you. It's something that fans will just never understand. I get that from the outside looking in. It's like, how could you support this guy? But it's always the way that it is in the NFL in terms of like guys in that locker room. It's a family. It's a brotherhood. They use those types of words all the time. So you're not necessarily judged off of your off the field, issues or problems that you've been involved in. They try to show you respect. And so again, just because you can't wrap your head around doesn't mean it's not true. So I do think that his teammates still try to support him, still try to understand like he's the quarterback. We gotta make this work with him. And there was that level of every team the base level like every team has of like respect for a teammate and a player. But once he's gone and the vibes change, it was hard to ignore how his presence did sort of feel like a weight was being lifted off their shoulders. And you got that sense being around those guys every single day. I also thought another interesting nugget from this piece that I found interesting was just this sense, the idea that when they met with Deshaun, the Browns, that is, when they first were trying to trade for him, they walked through like different clips of, hey, here's my offense. Here's how you'd fit in it. Here's ways that you could be really successful in this system and in this scheme. And that he seemed into it until he arrived in Cleveland and he never really embraced Stefanski's system. And the reason that's maybe the most interesting part of all of this is that I questioned from the beginning how this pairing was going to work. And given how it's played out, it blows my mind that this is the quarterback that they thought was going to be a fit and that they thought was going to work with Stefanski and what he wanted to do. And I just can't wrap my head around why they thought this was a good idea from Jump Street. I get that you were, I mean, I get why, because I talked about it a couple episodes ago. Like, yes, they were trying to pursue a franchise quarterback and an elite level quarterback. So I can wrap my head around why they wanted to do that. And that was the main goal they were trying to accomplish. But the fit just never was there. And to make it work as like an arranged marriage clearly didn't work. And so now you're kind of left in this dicey situation where you got to sort of rebuild on the fly, like we talked about. And it's just unfortunate that we got here because they tried to sort of fit a square peg into a round hole. And if you're going to tell me like, well, they didn't set him up for success, I will push back on that wholeheartedly, because I do think like that piece laid out and showed and should have showed everybody that they gave him the sun, the moon, and the stars. And coupled with what you heard Jack Conklin say at the end of the season, where he was like, we got to make our own identity you can't, building around one player doesn't always work, or doing everything about in the name of one player isn't necessarily going to help us be successful. I'm paraphrasing here, but you get the idea. I think I played that clip on this show. Those comments tied to this article, and how Deshaun fit the system in general, it felt too familiar, and it felt too obvious, like that was a problem from the start, and just made me question even further. So if you're somebody sitting here saying, well, listen, they didn't set him up for success, I would push back on that mightily, because I think they tried to give him everything. They gave him the receivers, they built a super team around him, they tried to set him up for success with the system that he wanted. They got him the offensive coordinator that was supposed to bring out the best of him. None of it worked, and it's time to pivot to something else and go back to what you do best. That's the bottom line, and that is going to do it for another episode of the Locked On Browns podcast. Thank you for joining me, as always, to talk about your favorite football team, and I hope you continue to make the Locked On Browns podcast your first listen every day. For your second listen, go find the new Locked On NFL show, or if you want to keep it local, you can check out Locked On Cavs, Locked On Guardians. I appreciate you being an everydayer with the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you real soon. But for now, I am out. Take care of yourself, Cleveland.